I am Dolev. I'll be moderating this panel. One of my goals for this panel is whether you're new to security in general, or senior, or you work for a small company, large company, you'll be able to get some actionable items, things that you can actually take home and think about. And we will do this kind of brainstorm discussions so that you can see how these experts will approach different problems. We do have a case study, but we will make it a discussion that may branch out to other places as well. So without further ado, I think we can get started. Round of introduction. Okay.
I'm David Sfiligoi, Director of Application at RBC, Application Security, sorry. So my role is to lead a pen testing team as well as bring transformation tools, security tools inside pipelines for developers and also for the security professional inside RBC.
Hello, my name is Opheliar Chan. I work for Security Compass, which is a software security company. We focus on software security both on the consulting side and also through our various products and our training services. And so that's what I do in my day job. And in I moonlight as one of the OWASP Toronto chapter leads. So OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project, and we're a not-for-profit organization that advocates for application security. So if you're interested in coming out, we do monthly meetups that bring together people in the AppSec space to talk about various problems in that space or give education around that. And then I also I am part of the Sector Advisory Committee, and I help out with a Hack Student, which is one of those organizations that reaches out to teenagers to try to teach them about cybersecurity. That's what I do.
Hi, I'm Naresh Kurada. I'm Director of Security Consulting at Avanade. Probably some of you might not know, Avanade is a joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft. So we have our good friend talk about us about Microsoft technology. It's essentially whatever Microsoft builds. In terms of the capabilities, is that what we do is that we take that and act as systems integrators and develop solutions for our clients. Being in part of the security practice, it's quite interesting, especially in the Microsoft space for us as an organization, because you know, it's and more so in the DevOps space, because it's consistently evolving, and the main messaging is that, you know, just as some of the panelists talked about, is shifting left. How do you make the customers think from the left as opposed to thinking all the way at the end? That's me. Thank you.
My name is Arani. I'm a manager with KPMG's cybersecurity practice. So I work with two different service lines within KPMG. So one is strategy and governance, and second is cyber defense. So defense being the more technology focused and more technical security assessment side of things, and strategy governance, of course, is, you know, the larger program level strategic side of cybersecurity. So increasingly, we have been working with a lot of clients who are a DevOps shop, and they're trying to adopt security in the DevOps process. Gonzalo and Praveen kind of touched upon some of the clients that we have worked on before. So looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. So my name is Dolev. I lead the security engineering at Paytm Labs, which drives Paytm, one of the largest payment ecosystem in the world today. Similar to Opheliar, I run DEF CON Toronto, and we also have monthly meetups. We're not specifically focused on web application. We're kind of all over. Everything that is hands-on and interesting we'll probably cover. I do like the kind of mix of skill sets and backgrounds that we have on stage today, and I think it'll be valuable getting insights into how to do security at scale with the backgrounds that we have here. So let's get started. So you do see the test case that we have in front of us. In this case, we have a Canadian company, 500 employees, 5 security engineers. The product is a peer-to-peer money transfer, meaning that there is some PCI DSS aspect to it, or compliance. In terms of environment, on-prem, hybrid, multi-cloud environment, whether it's AWS, Azure, Alibaba, you name it, it doesn't really matter. Just the fact that it's not just one kind of cloud. And with that, we also have the agile development lifecycle that is in place. And now the tricky part is, where does security come into play, and how do we actually do this? So I guess one of the things that I want to ask first is, we're talking a lot about culture and culture changes. How do we actually start, and what does culture change mean in that sense, with no like specific order?
I can take a stab at that. So I think culture change, it starts with education and awareness. At the end of the day, it's behavior change of people, right? It's not going to happen overnight. Some of the members before us spoke about the typical auditors and DevOps engineers kind of fighting it out. That requires education on both sides, importance of knowing why we are doing things in a certain way, why we are adopting DevOps in the first place, why velocity is important, and why security should not be, it should be embedded in the control should be embedded in the design rather than being like a blocker, right? So the education on both sides of the tables, that's important to understand, that it has to be a top-down driven mandate. It cannot be fought at a team's level. There should be an overall enterprise level education on that. I think that's where it kind of starts. The process kind of starts over there.
Inside this bank, actually, I've seen ground up culture change as well, right? Especially around the development side. So if I stick to this particular case study, I agree that education is very important in this, right? And this ratio of number of security professionals to employees is pretty typical across the industry. These 5 people are going to have a hard time to change a culture by themselves, right? So obviously, what you say about from the top, but these people should as much be embedded as possible with the development team if they can, or have sessions to teach from the ground up, right? And then I think, no, it's not always successful in a big organization like ours, but you have several teams that operate in a small scenario that can really achieve that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
just if I may add, one of the things that is critical for this is that the friction, right? And it's important that we must recognize or let people know that technology is moving at quite a fast pace, and for that pace, for everyone to catch up, we should all have that open mind to accept and embrace change, as opposed to being, oppose change. That was my 2 cents.
Okay. From a cultural perspective, I find that the development organizations are very aware of the whole concept of we're not going to get it perfect today. They've gotten into the agile methodology. They've gotten into the DevOps methodology. So their key is really about making progress, right? So we're not there today. Where are we going to be in 2 weeks? Where are we going to be in 6 months? Security, I find the biggest part of cultural and mindset change for a lot of security people is we're not going to do it today and we can be right, or we can make progress, right? So I'm going to scale back on the things that I really, really, really need people to do. Identify those couple of key controls that I really, really need to understand, a couple of key processes that I need to have in place. And I'm going to focus on those specific things, get them out there, get people used to them, get people to make progress on them, and then I'm going to pick apart other pieces later. So as a risk factor, it means you're leaving yourself temporarily very wide open to risk in the short term, but it means you'll make progress in closing risk overall throughout the company. So if the company doesn't understand that concept of we're going to make progress, and that means today it's going to be pretty messed up, then they'll never make it to finding consensus.
Awesome. So like David mentioned, we do have 5 security people. They will have a hard time to scale themselves. Given the fact that we have a PCI DSS compliance aspect, and there's always this debate that security is not compliance and compliance is not security, how do you think we should balance the efforts when it comes to security and compliance? How much time should we spend on compliance tasks, which might not make us more secure, maybe just give us some baseline, as opposed to, and not neglect security by itself?
I would say focus on what the regulators want, what is a must, right? If it's not a must, do it for later. Otherwise, you'll want to boil the ocean with compliance and security constantly, and you'll never be able to scale properly.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say the reality of things like PCI compliance is that you can shop for an auditor who both understands your predicament and can be flexible with the way that you implement the controls, right? So as an organization, if you decide to go that route, then you really have to find the auditor who's going to help you with it, like assist you with those things, and then they will have the discussion with you about like what are the mandatory things that you absolutely have to do, and how can you do both, like how you can meet your compliance requirement and also do the reasonably secure thing for you. Right. There are some things that the visa is just going to say you have to do it, and then you end up just doing it. Right.
So I'll just give my take on this, right? Like, what I like to do is that, most of these compliance as well as the good best practices can be mapped out. If not one-to-one, they can be mapped out as themes, right? Once you have those themes in place, it becomes easier to articulate. If this is your compliance that it must be met, this is how it's being met through the technology lens in a modern fashion. Right, so once you have that documented, it becomes a living artifact, and supplementing that is that the underlying infrastructure and the underlying practices, most of the cloud providers, right, because you're talking about the cloud, ensure that they are by themselves PCI compliant or all of these industry-related compliance, right? So you have two layers already embedded within this, and it'll be counter, I would say, defensive for an auditor to challenge such extensive work already being done.
I think I was speaking to one of the guys last week, and he mentioned, compliance is in the eye of the auditor, right? So it's really who is auditing the environment, and how much do they know about that environment, right? It's a DevOps environment, things are moving fast. That does not mean that they are non-compliant to certain things. So PCI DSS, for example, like the way they kind of word the controls in a certain way, the objectives can still be met in a secure DevOps environment. It's not that it's not there, right? It's how you translate that requirement to your DevOps engineer. So put a DevOps engineer in front of a PCI auditor, you'll see real fun beginning over there. They won't understand each other, right? So one is speaking a control language, one is looking for a checklist of items that they need, and a DevOps engineer is saying, yeah, everything is automated in code, right? You talked about infrastructure as code. This is my CI's hardening guideline as code. You think a PCI auditor is going to understand that? Yeah, sure. So it's more about, it starts with one, the education factor. Compliance should not be treated separately from your control objectives. Ultimately at the end of the day, you're trying to secure something. The objective is the same. It's how you translate that control out, how you artifact, how you evidence, that particular control, and how you kind of show the compliance to it. I think that translation that's a very important factor in it. In recent clients that we have worked with, I think that translation piece is where we have been able to kind of show value, right? So you have controls, and then you have a world where that's totally foreign. So being able to bridge those two worlds has been very successful for us.
Okay, awesome.
One other thing is that most auditors look for effectiveness of controls, right? And it'll be challenging to see how human effectiveness is when compared to machine effectiveness, because you're embedding all of the effectiveness in code, right? So you have a better quality of effectiveness in code built within the platform. So that itself is adding to the the desired outcome and reducing the defects of whatever.
Machines don't lie, right?
Sorry?
Machines don't lie.
And in DevOps worlds, you actually see, at times, if you're able to, the auditor is actually able to understand how the world works, it's actually better compliance because it's less human intervention, it's more automation. And once you automate one aspect of a security control, it's going to flow like that forever unless somebody changes that automation, right? So it's oftentimes you would see more effectiveness, so as to say, from a design and operating effectiveness once you kind of go down that path.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you work at RBC and at KPMG. large organizations with a lot of security people. Well, the companies are big themselves, right? But in many cases, we have companies, like in this case, 500 employees and 5 security people. How do we, so in some cases, we will have to delegate some of the security work, offload security tasks to other teams. How do we do that without compromising on the level of security in itself?
I think again, from a KPMG perspective, we are in a consulting side of the business. When we look at clients or when we deal with clients with similar issues, right, where you have 5 security personnel, 500 employees, right? Obviously, security has to be delegated out in terms of rules. You need to kind of delegate a control out to within one of those groups within your 5. So for example, for 500 employees, if you have an IT team within there who are technical enough to take up security roles, you need to kind of delegate that to them, right? 5 personnel is not going to be enough for servicing security controls for the entire organization. So educating again on the other side how what control is and what exactly you're kind of trying to do and how the implementation is going to be and what they are supposed to be doing, the roles and responsibilities, defining those out. I think that's one of the key part to kind of start with, at least.
I sort of agree, right? And at the same time, in a big bank like ours, it becomes very difficult to have a single point of control, single point of way of doing things, right? So effectively, you could look at us as lots of little 500 employee company with a group of central security people. So sometimes we're even more disconnected from what's going on on the ground, right? So how do we address this is really turning each of the people on the ground as somebody that has some basic knowledge about security, somebody that has basic knowledge on compliance, and let them self-regulate, let them resolve the issues and the challenge themselves under our guidance as enterprise teams, but not us being constantly in their way into this is how you have to do this, is how you have to do this, right? Breaking that ivory tower, right, effectively. This can't work anymore. And if we could embed some of our security people directly with those teams, but in some case we can't, right? That we get huge value out of that, much better security posture.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the automation part of this, right? So if you look at some of the DevSecOps, most of these automation tools and the testing tools by themselves are automated. That's how you scale out security, right? Because you're already automating a lot of the tasks that you need to be doing as a security person or a security analyst. It can be automated, right? We talk about robotic process automation, et cetera, and all of those kind of things. So all of these things are built into the platform, right? So what would be good is for that in that sense is to really move towards the left, right? And move towards the left in such a way that you're actually getting into those gates that you talk about in a traditional SDLC process, all the way towards the left, so that you're ingrained into the design, into the coding of these controls into the code, right? I mean, security controls into the code. So that's the way you scale out security in this modern, I would say modern application transformation, right? So it's really embracing that, right? Let's get involved right up front, conduct threat modeling exercises, draw out what is the threats, and then code it accordingly, as opposed to doing all of that at the end or at various intersections.
I'm glad you brought up automation because that's my next question. When we're talking about automation of security, secure DevOps is not only application; it's the entire stack. When a company just wants to get started with this process, what things do you think should they be going for? What are kind of the low-hanging fruits that a company with maybe not a lot of resources can go for, let's say, the first couple of stages?
So many ways. I think if it was a small shop, right, I would focus time on security instrumentation as opposed to scanning technology, etc. Scanning technology tends to need some people to manage the results, and it's very noisy, etc. Where you have instrumentation looking at the code inside out, you can provide the development teams very actionable results that is not going to be very noisy for them, and they can deal with the issues. And then after that, you start layering in more tools inside their process, right? That's how I would do it.
When people come to me with this problem, I tell them to concentrate first on IAM and asset management, because that is mostly built into the cloud already. And there is that gap time between when you're analyzing what a problem is and how people are doing things to providing the correct controls, right? But if you don't know where things are, and you don't have access to them, and nobody knows who has access to them, then you are never gonna get on top of that problem. So if you have one guy, then policy around IAM is probably your first thing, so that you can apply controls later because you know what exists. Once you get there, then you can start talking about, okay, now what does exist? Okay, what's ephemeral, what's not ephemeral? So what is long-lived versus very short-lived? How are we controlling the stuff that's long-lived?
So we start this test case with the 5 people, but let's say that you had to start this team from scratch. How would you prioritize the hiring profiles that you need to, let's say, get to a satisfying security level, not something that would prevent nation-state actors from getting in, but have some very good baseline? What kind of people do you need? What kind of skill sets?
So I'll sort of step back a little bit, right, from answering that question directly. But one, understand the technology, understand what you're doing, why and how you're going to do it, right? That's a key part to this. The other thing is that there are 5 things when you're in the DevOps mode, right? One is secure your pipeline, secure your identity, secure your data, secure your infrastructure, right? And and of course, secure your code too. Once you know what these 5 or 6 buckets are, it really becomes easy for you to put your mindset and wrap your head around what are these 5 objectives that you really want to do. And then later on, what comes is that, if you're rolling it out to, let's say, the PCI DSS, try to figure out, they'll inevitably fall into one of these 4 or 5 buckets, and it's, that's how you demonstrate it.
And quite possibly those 5 buckets that you described needs 5 different people, potentially, or at least some overlap, right?
Yeah, some overlap, absolutely. Yeah.
I kind of cut that in a slightly different way. So I sort of think about the layers of controls. So people talk about the 3 lines of defense, which is like audit and compliance, and then the operations and so on people, right? So there's the people across the different DevOps life cycles, and you kind of need people who understand how the processes work in each of those specific places. And then you also need, in this case, I guess, a compliance person, somebody who's willing to help you build out sane policies for things, right? They might not know what policies to build, but they have to have the mindset of building policies in the first place. And that's oftentimes people focus very much on getting very technical expertise at their table, but they do also need a communicator and a systems person who understands the process of getting audited and understands the process of getting things to security and compliance to work together, right? That mix of things, and then you can start talking about technologies, right? But the understanding in the first place, to have your security team understand what the engineering team is actually doing with their day-to-day lives, I think that is where I focus when I say, okay, you only have 3 guys. So have one guy who actually knows how to do operations and knows how to do security within that, or can figure it out, right? The rest of it is they'll figure it out if they can talk to people in the first place, because those first 5 people are really your evangelists. So they have to understand the infrastructure and the people to whom their audience is, or you really start off with this whole like chickens talking to cows kind of thing?
Yeah, going a bit tactically, I think
That's great.
in this particular case, I would start with, a security guy who knows actually how to code or read code, right? It's a software development company at the end of the day. If it's in a DevOps shop, it's probably going to be a bunch of things in code and doing a lot of with development tools. So probably hire a security guy who has a development background. And trust me, it's difficult to find one guy who's from a development background and has transitioned to more security controls and more of these processes way. And probably the second hire would be someone, as you said, like from a process standpoint and from a program standpoint, can structure this, this technical controls into buckets so that it meets compliance at some time. So you start off with a very technical guy, understanding what the ground is, put a structure with the program level guy, and slowly kind of start up building from there. That's where you should start from.
Okay, awesome. I do want to go back to the culture aspect of the conversation. Security is a never-ending list of things that should be done. There are so many things that you can do at so many levels, from network to application to systems. It's endless. Sometimes it's very exhausting for developers and people who own systems to follow and understand what the problem is and how to fix it and what's the real risk behind certain things. What do you think should be the discussion around the separation of, for example, production environment, staging and development, and the security importance that we need to give to each and every one of them? Should we give all of them the same importance given what we know about past breaches where data of customers was in a staging environment, or there was a misconfiguration or flat networking that allows pivoting from one network to another? What do you think? What are your thoughts about that?
So I think you're talking about a PCI shop. So PCI requires segregation in the environment. Again, stepping back into the risk of it, right? So the risk ideally lies in the fact that a developer having access to both environments can push an unauthorized code within a production environment, thereby breaking the controls, or they might manipulate some kind of a testing in the staging environment before it moves into production. So in a DevOps pipeline, you can actually have controls and you can actually automate this part out, have controls embedded in the pipeline itself that prevents such things from happening. So even if, the concept of developers having access to production, it's a bit different in DevOps. It's not necessarily the access to production, it's access to deploy in production. That's a very different concept, right? So you do not need direct access to kind of do a root login to a production server. However, you do need access to a pipeline that will push your code from, once you start your CI process, directly from your ID to the production server, right? So even though there may not be a very visible segregation in between the dev staging or a production environment, the controls can still be met through these kind of embedding controls in such pipelines.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You want to add something?
So you implement controls in layers, right? And depending on what layer you're talking about in the different like UAT dev environments and things like that, you can let go of some of the controls. I'd say keep all the logging because you want to know in the first place how far you're deviating from your eventual controls, because you do need to tighten them up as you go. But like the infrastructure controls should be similar but loosened, right? So start from your goal, start from your end goal, and then go backwards to how much do you really want to let go in here, and how much can you keep within the bounds of something else that's controlled? So how big a box do you need to draw around this thing in the first place, right? Because they're moving to cloud as well. So there's no such thing anymore as saying you're going to put a firewall between this thing and this other thing. So it's really about how much access the person has to a specific thing to deviate from the end result to get their job done.
Yeah, it's a balance between, I think, preventive control and detective controls at the end of the day, right? So you may not be able to put enough preventive controls in place just because it might slow down certain kind of delivery. However, having that detective control in place is a good enough compensating control. So if somebody is trying to put some kind of unauthorized code in your production environment, it might be easier to pick up versus slowing down with a preventive control, right? So it's a fine balance between the two. All the development, compliance in this case, and security personnel should be involved while making that decision. So everybody's on the same page when it comes to audit, right? It's not everybody has a different view as to production environment is not segregated from a development environment, but they're effectively kind of addressing the objective through it.
Yeah, I'd say also as we're moving towards like cloud and things that can cycle up and down and actually building things for cloud native, we're getting away from like long-lived services. So the more dangerous a specific function or like a specific environment is, the more ephemeral it should be. It's like if it's up for 5 minutes, then because I needed to test something, then I mean, it can be a little bit less secure than my production system that needs to stay up for the next 24 hours, right? And if it holds no important data, then I'm okay if it's temporarily breached, right? Or when I talk to people about microservices, they're like, well, it only does the one thing. So what difference does it make if the host is compromised for 5 minutes? It's going to go away, right? So I mean, it's still not good, but on the other hand, do I care in the sense that it's very highly risky? Well, okay, so it's not going to be around for very long, and I will take that into consideration when I talk to people about controls and risk and all that kind of stuff.
I like the word that there is a temporary breach. I wonder how the auditors are going to react to that, like temporary breach of an environment.
Just to, typically, right, most of you are aware of TRAs and all of that stuff. So it becomes quite interesting if you complete your TRA upfront, right? So you're really putting up that methodology and that process upfront, saying that, this is where we are going to agree on what the risk is. And then as per that risk, you are going to code accordingly to address your the rest of the infrastructure, right? So, using those practices very upfront, like the TRAs, the threat modeling, etc., really is where you can appease or bring this, bringing of minds, right? Meeting of the minds kind of thing.
Okay, great. So the next question that I have is specifically for the people who are new to security and want to start somewhere, and this is appealing for them. This whole secure DevOps thing, which involves so much stuff like coding and application security and platform and hardening and you name it. How should somebody who's just starting, what should they learn and what's the direction they should take to get there?
I think it's a new, fresh graduate starting out in this world. I would say learn one programming language. Like that's something that you should do no matter what. Like learn either Python or Ruby or something. Know the development process, right? So know the basics of code construct. I'm always a firm believer in the fact that if you learn one programming language, you can probably kind of read code for the others as well, because you know the fundamental constructs, you know the fundamental way of using things, right? And then on top of that, you can layer out the security layers, right? Don't focus too much on one technology or one particular kind of a product. You can always get product training. There are tons of videos out there, tons of free materials out there from when we started out. It's amazing the number of videos that you can see on YouTube and what you can learn from that, right? So I think start from one programming language, learn the security concepts, implement that, try that on your own, and just keep learning from that. Like, it's a very practical part is very important. It's not only the theoretical concepts. So just keep learning from that, doing code snippets, learning new things, talking with new people.
But one thing I'd like to add also is that there's a lot of tools now, gamified learning experience, that you don't need to know code. If you know basic logic, pseudocode, you can learn about security and application security specifically. I'm sure there's other tools for different fields, right? In a way that you don't have to go and get a university degree on coding, right? As long as you understand if and then and do that, you should be okay.
That's great. And I think today, that's my 2 cents. Today, more than ever before, there are so many platforms specifically for attack and defense and CI/CD pipelines, just building the pipeline itself, not necessarily on the security side. a lot more platforms that allow you to do that online, sometimes for free. So in terms of tooling and platforms, there's so much more out there that can help you get there.
Yeah. Just one thing, there's a saying that I truly hold dear to my heart, right? When the student is ready, the teacher will appear, right? So it's essentially that once you're ready for it, you'll find that there are tons of toolings, like the rest of my panelists were saying, tools out there and the widgets out there to get yourself up to speed on this, right? So I mean, at least in myself, I wasn't a DevOps person, but now I know quite a bit just because we all had the aptitude to pick it up at one stage or the other.
Yeah, it's about showing interest, I think, really. People ask me that question related to AppSec a lot of the times, and I say, well, it's a little bit like asking me, how do I practice medicine? I'm like, okay, that's a big topic. But if there's something specifically that, like an area that you're interested in, or even learning how to navigate the whole thing and understanding where your role might be, where you currently are, and what the closest mapping is, there are resources to do that. And the Toronto community specifically is very, very strong. So you can come out to like all the events, like the OWASP events, like the DC416 events, like the task events, and people are super nice. So if you go to them and you say, I have a problem and I really want to understand how I can become a cybersecurity professional or do something in this space and like learn about this or that, or like to try to start solving a specific problem or understand where people in a specific space are, you will have people who are willing to mentor you, but you have to go look for them. They won't magically, not quite as magically as you say of here, but you can find them and they will help you with the very specific like next actionable steps. Because to say like, I want to learn security is a really big thing, right? What part of security? Well, we can talk about that.
Great answers. Do we have time to take questions? 5 minutes. Do we have any questions? Yeah. Go for it.
If I'm a security person, I know controls, but I'm used to drawing in the lines. I have this piece of hardware. I have this piece of software. I configure my piece of software, and I don't step out of that piece of software. Then how do I take somebody that can't write a hello, let alone a push to get, but knows security, knows controls, and be able to get them into the ability to think in terms of DevOps, and then the SEC would naturally come to them? How do I kind of turn the SEC DevOps on its head and take a person that knows SEC and get them to understand DevOps?
Mm-hmm. So that's it. We have been, dealing with clients who are going through the same journey, right? So when you are doing audit or when you know security part of it, you know what risk you are mitigating, right? So don't get hung up on the control itself. Like don't get hung up on what you're trying to look for to satisfy the control, but focus on the risk first, right? So what you're trying to solve for it, right? Then, it's all about learning that specific technology, right? When you say DevOps and Git, these, you can easily learn these concepts, right? Once you learn the concept and it's overlaying what risk is mitigating, right? And not focusing on what evidence do I need or what, artifacts do I need. Once you kind of, cross that bridge over, once you start learning those technologies, these things will come into play.
Yeah, I agree. Start from the why. I agree. Start from the why, and then you can go from there to figure out the how. Because if you can correctly articulate to people why you want something done and what the importance is, then they will be able to tell you whether or not they can find different solutions for mitigating that control, right? They're the experts at the technology, you're the experts at the what is it that we're trying to protect against, right? So if you can't articulate data security and the concept behind data security and the why it's necessary to do that, then as a security professional, you have failed in the communication part.
We have another question at the back. Over there. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, quick question from the client side perspective, right? So there has been a lot of pull on the DevOps over these years, but when it comes to DevSecOps, it's still kind of a push mode where security professional community is still pushing back to the customers saying, hey, you also need DevSecOps. Just don't get hung up on DevOps because your competitor took up the transformation. You want to also embark on that DevOps. So how do you guys feel the market need, the appetite or the pulse on the DevSecOps versus the DevOps per se? I have that challenge always whenever we meet customers that, hey, we are the DevOps journey, but security, okay, probably phase 2 or phase 3, we can think about it. So these are the typical responses what we receive.
You know, I'll just give
I don't know whether you guys, but I do have that challenges.
So, I mean, I'll just give you my thing. I'm in a similar boat. We're all probably, as consultants, you know, we do all face that similar challenge. But it goes back to having that, you know, breaking down that barrier, right? And talking to them about, you know, it's DevOps, you have fulfilling a business objective. You producing an artifact or something for the organization, which is either generate revenue or something of that nature, right? What if it is breached, right? Have you ever thought about it? What risk that you would be, you know, making the organization bear if it's breached, if there's a compromise? Do you want to be, you know, the talk of the town, right? So it's coming back and talking to them is that, you know, this is the risk that you have to deal with, and this is how probably security can help you in that journey to mitigate that risk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the reason is so DevSecOps, like, I think those are marketing plays, to be honestly, at the end of the day. DevOps is a process like any other process at the end of the day. Security, you know, the selling point should not be your computer is doing SecDevOps, you should be doing SecDevOps as well. It's a natural requirement that should come in. It's a non-functional requirement. Security is always treated as a non-functional requirement, right? So that should come in naturally. It should not be that your computer is doing it, that's the reason you should be doing it. That's not the sales point. Your sale point is, you know, this is something that's naturally in your organization. Security lies in some other form, probably as a different framework in, you know, in other parts of the organization. It's just a new process whose velocity is much higher than what the security velocity is, right? So that's the reason, you know, somebody signs a contract and then involves security to kind of vet the contract, right? So same concept, right? So something that has moved ahead of the security curve and they need to play a catch up to it. So it's, again, it's not SecDevOps versus DevOps. It's mostly doing security into DevOps, which is already there in the organization in the first place.
And I actually don't think that this problem is a DevOps specific problem. I think this is a security problem in general. So in the last 20 years, we as a security community have made huge strides in getting to the table at all the different like organizational levels to say security is actually very important, right? So we have a C title now. Like that wasn't even on the radar before. But there are still organizations for which we have to acknowledge that the product itself is more important than any of the other things, right? At a very small, like at small company level, they're really just still trying to keep the lights on and productize something and make it work. There's no, like, I was talking to one of the guys who used to work at Etsy, and he did a talk last year at B-Sides, and he was saying how important really is security. And it's like, there's no, and he basically said, like, there's no company that you start where you're saying, like, I don't know what the product's gonna be and all that kind of stuff, but it's gonna be really secure, right? It doesn't happen. So there is still that aspect of like, yes, the thing itself is more important than the activities you're gonna do to it. And you have to acknowledge that as security people, and understand that there is that breaking point where the aspects of like disaster recovery and business continuity actually become a factor after you can pay your rent, right? And then security becomes part of your like acknowledgement, a part of business continuity, becomes part of disaster recovery, becomes part of all those things, right? So when the company is ready to do disaster recovery, they never argue about whether or not they need to back stuff up. So they should also never argue in some ways about whether or not they need security, because security is part of their ability to back stuff up, right? So that's how I talk to people about it. But first, I do acknowledge that my job is secondary to the product itself.
Yeah, we have one more question in the back.
Just a comment, actually. Just wanted to just reiterate, and you nailed it, right? At the pace of innovation that you're releasing software, security is not an option. I'm not going to do that later. How am I going to release something that's secure if I don't have DevSecOps in place, right? So it's much to your points, right? It's like it's always seen as an afterthought. Let's get the functionality out there. Let's get the feature out there, and security is more of an afterthought, or it's done in a different way. As far as I'm concerned, it's DevOps with security baked in. It's not DevSecOps and DevOps. If DevOps includes security, it's there, it's inherent, or else you're not releasing at the pace of innovation. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, at the back, I think he was raising his hand in the beginning.
Thank you. My name is Surubi, and first of all, I would like to thank. It was a very engaging panel discussion and a very interesting case study. I've been an auditor, and I'm a part of the internal audit team. So, very interesting thoughts about audit and security. What are your thoughts on audit maintaining that independence of actually, while the mindset shift has to happen, that audit has to be engaged and not play catch up, but still, how would audit maintain that independence to provide that opinion without being completely hands-on into SecDevOps?
And take a jab at that. So when you talk about independence, it also kind of indicates towards integrity of the audit, right? So, for example, when your auditor function, right, if you're not embedded in it, if it's basically maintaining a one-arm distance to it, the way you can achieve that, this automation pieces that we talked about, right? Ensuring the integrity of the automation, I think that's what your independence translation is. So in a traditional world, you would basically have a third line audit come in and audit the first line functions, right? Based on what second line is providing. But in this world, if you have automation in place where there's a non-human actor doing a set of steps, and you ensure the integrity of that automation piece, ensure the integrity of that first set of piece, the design principles, your opinion on how the security should be, I think you achieve your independence in some way, right? It's not exactly how you traditionally see it, but in an ideal world where everything is automated, this is the only way you have to ensure that. Because once one thing is automated, unless you change that automation factor, you change that configuration, it's going to keep doing it the same way, right?
Awesome. We're good? Yeah, awesome. So thank you so much. I think the answers were incredible. And the questions were all pretty much open-ended, so there was no one right answer. It was great to hear the experience talking. So thank you very much, panelists. It was awesome.